Thank you. So, good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. I'm glad that you want to talk about this issue because I just think it's just such an important issue to discuss. Kind of looking at the piece around trauma, but really what we want to talk about is doing work that makes a difference for the people that we're actually serving. And I always think of this work as service, honestly. When I first started in this field, and I'm not going to age myself, but when I first started in this field, there were very few people who were doing anything comprehensive in trauma work. And I recall being a student, I was working on my PhD, and I kept getting these clients who had these terrible trauma histories, and my supervisors had a kind of a gap. And there was also a gap in the research, and there was a gap in the treatment protocol field. And it was a problem because I'm looking at these people going, I can support you, but I don't really deeply know what to do. And that was a huge problem. And I started to do everything I could to read everything in the market, to think about things from the perspective of the client. What was really missing? Why is it that they weren't recovering? And then I remember a couple of pivotal moments. I went to a conference, and it was a military-based conference. And I sat in that audience, and I remember a couple of psychiatrists coming up and speaking to the group and saying, if somebody has been traumatized, there is no treatment and no recovery. This doesn't go back that long ago, honestly. Not so long that I should have heard that. And I was so shocked when I heard that, and I just couldn't accept that that was going to be the case. And as I started to work more deeply and learn more about trauma and what was really making a difference for people, I started to recognize that there were certain things that actually did make a difference. Another case that I worked on early on in my career, I worked with this individual who had a very difficult childhood. His father was a violent alcoholic, and what his mom would do, so the violent alcoholic in the family, that's trauma number one, right? Trauma number two is mom trying to protect him as a young child, would take him and put him into a closet that she could lock, like a little cupboard in the kitchen, right? Like one of those lower cupboards. And so he'd sit in the cupboard listening to dad beat mom, right? I mean, that's not a story that's a story you've heard, right? It's a story I've heard. It's not the only time I heard that kind of a story after that first interaction, but the first interaction was important because what it did is it made me realize that I was in graduate school at the time. I was not getting the tools that I needed to really do a good job with my clients. So what I did that was correct was I was present and compassionate. But that was never going to be enough, ever. And so what I recognized is I needed to take what I was seeing worked and bring it to a level that could help them move to stabilization, memory, remembrance, and mourning, and working through, and recovery. Recovery being the reconnection with all the things that are meaningful in life that take us to a place where we know what we know and we can move forward. Because life is really about moving forward. It's not about staying in that, I'm fixed now and I can't get through this and I've been devastated and that's it. There's not going to be anything else for me. So it became so important for me to know that the work that I was doing was going to make a difference, was going to make a real difference. And so, I started to put some things together, and it was very exciting because in working with Dr. Charles Figley, Dr. Eric Gentry, we did a lot of dialogue. I was living in Florida at the time when I first started to really conceptualize my ideas around doing good trauma work. And what we started to recognize was there were certain key components that really did need to be in place before people were going to make those steps to progress. And the biggest piece was stabilization. Without stabilization, I mean, I can get them to talk about their traumas. People trust me. I'm glad about that. But I didn't want them to trust me to tell me their story until they had stabilization, because without the physiological ability to self-soothe, it's just like you're exposing yourself to trauma, and now you're getting overwhelmed by the memory. And it's too much to bear. The body won't tolerate it. So there's no upside to getting people to tell the story without that stabilization piece. So we would do all this work around stabilization, and once that was really and deeply in place, people were then able to get to a point where they could work with these really deep exercises for working through. And in this field today, now there's all sorts of different approaches which are wonderful, very effective. Many of them come from a variety of different angles, but the point is it's all about working through the trauma, and that's really about exposure. And if we're doing a good job, it's exposure with relaxation of some sort, and then we get to a place where we can resolve the trauma, or it stops being ignited. We can't forget the trauma, we can resolve it. We get to a new place. And then people start to come to session and they say things like, oh, like I joined a bowling group, or, I just started to, go out a little bit more. I noticed I've been calling my friends a little bit more often, or I'm accepting invitations more. And that happens naturally. And if it doesn't happen naturally, we can give them tools to get them to move in that direction. But probably about 7/8 of the people that I work with will come and start telling me they started the reconnection portion of trauma work on their own. Okay, that's the whole program. You could go home now.